Hi, I'm Pam Yellens, and I'm the TA for Understanding the Young Child, and I'm here with Pat Ryan.
Hi, nice to meet you.
So why don't we start by having you tell us a little bit about your professional role in your research?
Well, I'm Associate Professor of Childhood and Social Institutions at King's University College, and I have a cross appointment in history. I'm trained as a historian, and I focus all my research around essentially childhood and social institutions. I came to Canada 10 years ago. I'm originally from Nebraska, but I came from the University of Texas at Dallas. And got a call from a faculty member, Alan Pomfret, at King's College, and they were looking to build a program that became Childhood and Social Institutions, and I came here as part of that project. So all of my research is focused on not only education, but the structure of policies and laws and ideas that have created sort of present-day perspectives on children and youth, and the way that's structured. So that's what I'm interested in, and I do all my work historically.
Okay, so why don't you tell us a little bit about the paper that we're going to be talking about today?
Well, this is connected to the story that I just told you, is that when I came to King's, I was in a new environment. I had been cross-appointed in history and the teacher certification program at the University of Texas at Dallas, and so I had been used to an interdisciplinary environment and working with teachers and people who were interested in children and working with children, and that had been great for me. It had complemented my research interests in history, but that sort of level went up into a more general interdisciplinary approach to childhood, and that presented some curricular difficulties for me. How do I face a room full of students who aren't historians or aren't studying history and aren't necessarily interested in history or ideas or social institutions? In childhood and social institutions, what we get as students is our students are very much interested in working with children broadly. And sometimes that doesn't, we get a lot of diversity there, but sometimes they're not necessarily interested in the structure of thought. Their perceptions, the baggage that they come in with. So I was trying to get them to consider, to reflect upon what they already came in with and where that, in terms of assumptions and ideas about children, because they come in with an arsenal. And everybody's an expert because we've all been children, or that's what people think. So it was a real challenge, and so what the diagram was about was, it started as just a way to try to simplify a very complex historical narrative about the history of childhood, and to place it into categories and to give the students some language, some tools, so they could speak about it or write about it, or if they were reading or an article or thinking about a debate or an argument, they could begin to hear, oh, this perspective is really assuming some romantic things about children, or this perspective is assuming that everything's driven by conditioning, or this perspective is taking seriously children's agency or will as really important, or this other perspective is focused on mechanisms of biological development. And unless you can give people some categories, words, shorthand for it, it's overwhelming. It just seems like a lot of noise, and it's hard to know what to think. So it was a teaching exercise originally.
Yeah, it's really good. So then, do we have the other diagram up on the screen to explain a little bit about the landscape of modern childhood?
Yeah, I think the place to start is to, first of all, lower, not so much to lower the expectations, but to understand that a representation is never can explore all the diversity, complexity, and layered elements of reality. And just to speak metaphorically, if we think about this as a map, if we had a map of London and you tried to put everything on the map, it would be worthless. And actually maps have certain conventions. And one of the most important conventions is that our maps of, for instance, London, Ontario, will be organized around north, south, and east and west,
Right.
right? And they will have streets. And in fact, there's a convention that encourages our streets today, since about 1790, to be gridded. They didn't used to go to an old city and they go in circles and it's hard to use a map, right? So the map, the representation, and the practice are linked, and they're simplifications that allow us to do something practical, navigate space.
Right.
But of course, maps, not only do they not have every tree or every name of a person on there, but maps, our map of our city, there are whole orders of existence, if I could use that language, that a map does not try to address. A map does not try to tell you how something sounds or how it smells, right? It doesn't try to do a lot of things. If it tried to do all those things at once, it again would be like the experience of being on a street,
Right.
which gives you all those things, but doesn't help you navigate that street. So we need to understand this as a gross simplification. And if it is a simplification, to use it, we have to understand what it is trying to do and what it is not trying to do. The categories on this map, this landscape, are not types of children. That would be the number one mistake.
Okay.
The unit is not types of children. The unit is discourses about childhood. That's a hard distinction to get our heads around, and I don't know that I can do it in a few minutes here. But let me give you a story. This is about a year ago. I have 3 children, and my son is the middle child. I think he was in either 6th, maybe 7th grade. And we were sitting around the table. We always talk about our day, and he had been on a field trip, and I said, well, what did they do? And Jack said, well, I think they gave us something called a personality test, and these questions we were supposed to answer, and then they tried to say that there were 4 types of people, and then he kind of looked at me like this, and he said, Dad, and I think he was like shaking his fork at me at this point, Dad, the world isn't divided into 4 types of people. It's just not that simple. And I love that story, and the reason I love that story is because it's true. It's an observation that you don't have to go to college to figure out, as the phrase from the great American folk singer Utah Phillips would have it. You don't need a lot of education to figure out that oversimplification is dangerous. And what he was rejecting there was the notion that you could put 4 types of people on a map. And that's particularly difficult because we feel very strongly about our own individuality, and that's what he was expressing. This map doesn't even try to do that. What it says is there have been 4 dominant lines of thought, bodies of thought. Discourse is the general word, ways of representing childhood, thinking about childhood, ordering institutions, and that have developed and defined the modern landscape of childhood. They overlap with each other, they compete with each other, they mutually exist with each other. And here's another really important thing about the 4 discourses that I'll introduce in a second. Every person that's thinking about children or caring about children or just dealing with children or has children in their horizon has access simultaneously to all 4 discourses. No person is on the map in any one landscape, because that's not how ideas work. Ideas don't belong to people. Ideas belong to all of us, and they exist as ideas only if they're shared. So conceptually, this is really important to not misread what I'm trying to say here. It's a gross radical simplification, and it's about ideas and representation and practices, and not about persons. When you look at any diagram, this is a Cartesian diagram. It works on 2 dualisms, just like north and south are opposites, east and west are opposites. And the 2 dualisms that I think are really important for modern personhood or modern childhood is the distinction between viewing children as subjects, thinking about children as subjects who participate in their own representation, and the act that is most seminal to a subject participating in their own representation is the capacity to speak, the capacity to tell a story about the world. So subjects have the ability not to do anything. They just have the ability to contribute to their own representation and to giving meaning to things outside themselves. So you can view children as subjects who participate in their own representation, and that is in tension with viewing children as products of environment or biological processes. So if children are products of environment or biology, then they are objects to be studied under controlled conditions. Now, I know that sounds really terrible, and I'll let others engaged in the moral critique. I think that's just a description of what human science is. Science requires controlled experiments, and it has to assume that the mechanism of measurement is not changing the dynamics of what is being measured. If the mechanism is changing the dynamics of what is being measured, then you have a problem with the scientific method.
Yeah.
Because the target moves based not on its nature,
Yeah.
but based on your experiment. And when we see that happening, we're thinking about that thing as a subject that knows and realizes and has cognition, right? So that's an opposition that's very important. And then it's different than this other opposition. Notice I haven't identified any of the quadrants. I'm talking about the axes. If this was a number line, you need to talk about what the axes are, or the units of analysis, first, before you talk about what it means to be on that axis anywhere. The x-axis here is defined by another dualism that's very important for the modern world, and that is the dualism between seeing childhood, not children, but childhood as a natural phenomena versus seeing childhood as a cultural construction. And so we think about natural phenomena, the weather's a natural phenomena, and sometimes it might be hard for people. It's easy to see how science studies nature, but there's another discourse about subjects being natural, and that's when and we say it all the time, when someone says, well, why do you feel that way or think that way? Well, I just feel it in my heart. That comes from a certain discourse about the natural person.
Yeah.
And that we identify that with the word romanticism. So it's not only science that deals with nature, there's another definition of nature, and it's the authentic soul of a person. Then the other object here, or the other dualism, is if we don't think about childhood as natural, but we think about it as a construction, what we're asking is a very different question, and that is, how do we make it? You know, and that doesn't mean that it doesn't have any structural processes. This building is a structure, but we recognize that you could build lots of different kinds of buildings, and that buildings don't have a nature the way hurricanes do, right? That doesn't mean that there is no natural rules about constructing. It doesn't mean you can do anything you want, but it's fairly open-ended what you'll actually produce. This means that childhood can be many things. This tends to be childhood is bound and more determined, whether that determination is authentic and romantic or more scientific and structured in the body. So if you put these two dualisms together, what I think you come up with is 4 possibilities. I've talked about romantic developmentalism. That is, if you see children as subjects and you view them as natural subjects or authentic subjects, I'm going to call that romantic developmentalism, or a search for authenticity through the child. We see children as innocent. We see them as true. We see them as the natural person with limitless possibilities. The opposite of that is the conditioned child, but it's not just the opposite. An opposite always has a relationship. If a child has limitless possibilities, what's logically implied is the opposite. You could determine through conditioning what those possibilities would end up being. So romanticism actually employs its opposite, socialization theory, and actually historically, this diverts a little bit, romanticism is a critique of a really strong notion of socialization, the conditioned child. Seeing children as a construction, but as products of that construction. People are very familiar with stage theories, with, let's say, Kohlberg's theory, stages of moral development. That's a good example of seeing children as a natural phenomena that can be studied under controlled conditions. And then our program in CSI is committed to this part of the quadrant. So part of the reasons that I constructed the diagram this way is it'll allowed me as a teacher to say, what's distinctive about the point of view that we're offering in our program? And the catchphrase that we give for that is, our program in CSI is committed to the notion that there are multiple childhoods that have been produced in the past and that can be produced in the present, that can be constructed, and that children participate as competent agents in the construction of that childhood, in the construction of the institutions that frame it. And when you begin seeing childhood that way, the word that I would give to that is you're opening the door on a notion that the child can be political. The generational relationships can be political. They're about who gets what. They're about what life means. They're about what is good. They're about what the rules should be, right? And that's not a negative word, politics, but it's a notion that children are competent agents. So that's a little bit about the landscape. It kind of went on, but it's a device in the end. But I think it's a helpful device because I think these are the four dominant threads that make up our sense of what it is to be and become human in the modern world.
Well, I think that leads directly into the next question, which is the implications for early childhood education.
As a historian, part of what I had a goal as a teacher, and this fit with case studies and historical work I was doing, but I didn't design it to have a particular implication for schools or for teacher education. That's the first thing to say, sort of just honestly. But after the fact, I would say this, that if you begin seeing that there are competing ways of viewing, thinking about it, and organizing institutions for children, then that hopefully will make you reflect and see that the choices that you're making and that others are making are indeed choices, that there's more than one possible school. There's this great book written by an American historian of education, David Tyack, called The One Best System. And that captures the thesis of that book, which is that schools became organized in the late 19th through the mid 20th centuries around the very compelling idea, and it was motivated by progress and goodwill, but that we could make schools that were designed as a one best system. There's a problem with that, in that if there's multiple possibilities for learning, if there are multiple ways to understand children or to be a person in the modern world, and obviously, as my son would say, way more than four, then we ought to reflect and think about the choices we're making. So that's the first thing. Reflect, think, accept debate, accept ambiguity. Don't be so sure. I think that's the worst result of the application of developmental science within institutions for children. Sometimes it's the simplest things that the scientists had to offer, and not the more nuanced things that they had to offer, not the doubt. I mean, the one basis of science is supposed to be doubt. How come doubt never gets translated? Right?
Yeah.
It doesn't, because bureaucracy is not about doubt. So the first thing is accept ambiguity, entertain and respect multiple points of view, and let's see if we can find spaces for that. The second thing, and it's related, would be understand that one idea, one policy, one practice, one assumption is connected to others. That you can't have it always, all the time, without implications. And let me give an example. If you want to heavily age grade schools, and you want to put children of all the same age in a room for 50-minute or 90-minute periods, and you want to provincially structure the curriculum, and you want to blueprint that all on a larger level, there are going to be limited realities that can be produced out of that structure by teachers, by children in those situations. Why? Because one practice, one idea will curtail other possibilities. So it really matters whether or not we decide to have standardized testing. Because testing isn't just about testing. Testing is always about curriculum. You can't expect to do one thing in a larger system and not do other things. So we need to know that there's a lot at stake when we go along with one part of a system and think about its implications for the others. So those are two things. Then there's a third thing, and this isn't related specifically to this, but I would suggest this, and that is that I think that there's a lot of anxiety about children out there today, and this is where I'm really advocating for a social actor approach to childhood and youth, and so I'm taking a position on the landscape and not just talking about the landscape as a device. I hear a lot of negativity. I mean, the things that are said about children, if you replace them with any other group, it would be unbelievable, and people get away with it. And they say it in casual conversation. It's in headlines in newspapers. Very negative statements about children being incompetent, children being up to no good, children being lazy, children being out of control, children needing more discipline. And I think that's all rubbish. I think it's actually the opposite. Just as a teacher, one thing that I see when students come into my class, and now they're young adults, is I have to almost work them out of the anger they have about the system. They've been in it for 12 years. It's so structured, it's hard for me to get them to speak, to find what they really care about and what they're willing to put themselves entirely into. And I would argue, along with John Dewey and others, that whatever you think you're doing, you're not ever learning for anyone else. Teaching is not learning, and we ought to do more of trying to get out of the way, because the degree to which we confuse teaching with learning, we stomp out the ability of people to take ownership of their own learning and to make it happen. I never made anyone learn anything. I could only try to provide an environment where they were motivated to teach themselves. And when that magic happens, there is no predicting what people are capable of. So the degree to which this gets people to see that social actor theory can be articulated and is possible and is not silly and has a relationship to the other dominant discourses of romanticism, developmentalism, and socialization, maybe it serves that purpose as well.
Fantastic. Thank you.